It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this meeting of the seminar. We're very lucky to have with us two very interesting speakers. I want to introduce first of all our main speaker, Romain Huret, who is maître de conférence at the Université de Lyon, Lyon 2, since 2005, and he is a junior member of the Institut universitaire de France. He's also a member of the Centre d'études nord-américaines, the Center for North American Studies at the CNRS, and an international contributing editor of the Journal of American History, and also a member of the editorial board of the Revue Française d'études nord-américaines, the French Review of North American Studies. Among his many publications, A Rich Man on Trial, Andrew W. Mellon, Tax Evasion and the New Deal Policy, 1935 to 1937, which is about to come out. His book, Taxed, American Resistors to Taxation from the Early Republic to the Present, is under contract with Harvard University Press, expected out in 2013. His book on Hurricane Katrina, 2005, came out in 2010, and he is also the author of La fin de la pauvreté, les experts sociaux et la guerre contre la pauvreté aux États-Unis, 1945 to 1974, the war against poverty in the United States, which is now being translated by Cornell University Press, so we can soon read it in English. He's going to be speaking to us today about profits or Mavericks, tax resistors, social protests, and political failure in France and the United States, the 1940s to the 1970s. So we have an interesting comparative study here. And before I allow him to start off, I just want to say that we are very fortunate today also to have with us William Martin. I don't know which language I'm talking. Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and the Urban Studies and Planning Program at University of California, San Diego, who will comment on his paper. Isaac Martin studies how social protests affect the way democratic states distribute resources. His first book, The Permanent Tax Revolt, won the President's Book Award from the Social Science History Association and received an honorable mention for the Distinguished Scholarship Award of the Pacific Sociological Association. He's edited two books about the history and politics of taxation, so he is very well placed to comment on Romain's talk, and I will now let Romain speak.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for inviting me here today. As it has been mentioned, I will have today a comparative perspective on tax resistance both in France and in the United States from the post-World War II period to the 1970s. And today I will just show you and try to understand those kinds of movements. For instance, in 1959 in Wrightsville, Washington State, you have women organizing a demonstration to protest against local and federal taxes, and they brought petitions to the state capitol and hoped to create what they call a movement from the kitchen to the capitol, to Washington, D.C. And today I will try to explain that the tax resistance movements in post-World War II periods were what I call ideological resistance against national taxes, both in France and in the US. First, let me just very, very quickly focus on the words I used in my book and in this paper. Tax resistance is a public act or action against taxes by individuals who comply with the tax system but do not consent. In my book, I make a difference between, on one side, ideological resistors who have a vertical opposition against the state and its fiscal power, refuse the fiscal power of the state and federal government in the United States. And on the other side, you have what I call pocketbook resistors. They have a horizontal opposition, and they used to pay taxes, they accept to pay taxes, but one day, at a specific moment, taxes suddenly appear as unfair, and then they start refusing paying the taxes and joined ideological resistors in the broader social movement. And what I'm very interested in my book, which started in the Civil War until the Tea Party movement, is the connection between the two. When ideological resistors convinced pocketbook resistors to join the anti-tax parade. And it's a very key moment for people who study tax resistance, but it's not automatic. I mean, we have movement when ideological resistance is very high, for instance, in the 1930s, but those resistors, mostly from the upper class, failed to convince pocketbook resistors and citizens in the US to join the anti-tax parade. So the main argument in this paper and in this comparison is that in the United States, the movement of this ideological movement turned into a broader pocketbook movement from the 50s to the 70s, in the 70s and early 80s. In France, the ideological resistance was limited and partly marginalized in the early 1980s. And that's what I will try to show you today in this paper. So let's start with the first wave of tax resistors, the ones who follow World War II. And as you probably know, after World War II, both in the United States and in France, it was a time of the so-called fiscal consensus. Many policymakers, many politicians, many intellectuals accepted the Keynesian principles in the field of taxation. So you have very few people who protested against taxes, and most of the time, as I will show you, they were considered as mavericks, as crazy, paranoid people. And so let's start with those two movements, both in France and in the US. In France, you have a very, very famous movement, the movement of Pierre Poujade, which started in 1953 and which gave birth to a movement called Poujadisme. And the movement was a centralized one, and very, very quickly Pierre Poujade decided to create a national organization and to have members of his movement elected to the French Parliament. And the movement was a populist movement. It was made up against the elites in Paris, who defended the Keynesian policy, who defended the fiscal consensus, and members of the Poujade movement accused the elites of corruption, accused the elite of creating conspiracy against the people, against poor people, and you have many mentions of secret deals between some politicians and some big corporations in France in the 1950s. And all this was done against poor people, les petits in French, ordinary citizens who didn't have access to the elite cycles in post-war years in France. And you have something also very interesting and very similar to the American case. It was a feeling that the foreign policy went wrong in France. It was in the early 1950s, after the French-Vietnam War, and many members of the Poujade movement feared the loss of the French Empire, which was part of the French identity. And they accused the elites, especially in Quai d'Orsay, the French who were in charge of the French foreign policy, of abandoning the French Empire and losing what was part of the French identity. So just to sum up, the movement was what a French sociologist, Alain Touraine, called a movement from le pays, the country will be the best translation, against the state. And it was a very interesting movement. And we have a similar movement, even already there are some, of course, differences in the United States. In the United States, after World War II, you have a very loose network of conservative organization. It was not a centralized movement. You don't have any leaders. You have some very famous characters supporting tax resistors, such as General MacArthur after in the 1950s, or Walt Disney, a very famous tax resistor. and who gave money to Goldwater's campaign in 1964, but very, very early on, who opposed taxation and gave a lot of money to this network of small conservative organizations. What is also striking in the 1950s for this new wave of ideological tax resistance is that it was a movement of middle class. And that's different from the 1920s and 1930s, where the movement, this ideological movement of resistors, was composed mainly of upper class people. And I think something happened, and I will go back to that in a few minutes, during this period, where upper class, a big corporation, started to give up on the anti-tax creed, and the middle class at that time, 1950s, 1960s, was at the head of this tax resistance movement. Many tax resistors joined the Goldwater campaign in 1964. I'll give more details in my paper, but it was for them. It was 1964 should have been the year during which the country, the United States, would have given up this fiscal consensus. Similar to the French case, you have the same populist rhetoric of a movement against, the people against the elites in Washington, or against, as one of the tax resistors, a woman named Vivian Callams, call him High Tax Harry, for Harry Truman, President Harry Truman. So that's the same, the ideas that there was on one side people, elites defending a fiscal consensus, and the other side there were the people paying for the fiscal paying for it. One more thing, similar to the French case, many tax resistors were against the Cold War and the idea that the United States had to pay for it, and that taxpayers' money were used for supporting countries such as Greece or Italy. And many tax resistors question the waging of the Cold War by elites in the Truman administration and in the Eisenhower administration. So that's for the similarity between the two movements. You have some differences, and I will now focus on the differences. First, and I will maybe have a look at the two movements of resistance. In the French case, the Poujade people felt they were excluded from modernization, from what happened in the country at that time. They were excluded from the large, big projects of modernization of the country, and as Isaac has shown in his great book on the revolt against tax property, it was a revolt against the modernization of the fiscal state at that time, but also the ideas that a new elites born out of the French resistance had taken the power after World War II and was changing the country. And most of them, for most of the elites, came from the École Nationale d'Administration, the ENA, which was created after World War II to transform the country. And most people in the Poujade movement, resented it and denounced what they felt was a deep transformation of the country, and they felt they were out of this. As in the American case, and as many studies on the American conservatism have shown, the people blaming taxes were part of the modernization of the country. I mean, in the booming states, in California or in southern states, they were part, of this movement of suburbanization and modernization of the country. So that's the first difference between the two movements, the way they looked at the transformation of the country after World War II. The sociology of the movement are different. Let me start with the American case. What is striking when you compare the two movements is the role of women in the American case. You have many women, small business women, or just housewives, criticizing the fiscal consensus, and they defended a view of domesticity and of the role inside the family unit. And in the French case, I mean, and I've asked some new scholars on Poujade and tax resistance movement in France, because I'm not an expert, but they told me that in the archives there are very few mentions of women and of the role of women in the movement against against tax collectors. Something quite different. In France, the movement was more violent, and tax resistors wanted to have face-to-face contact with revenue collectors, and you have a lot of mentions of physical attacks against revenue collectors in the Poujade movement. And as far as I know, and maybe Isaac has another examples, but in the United States, you don't have such examples in the 1940s and 1950s. You don't have any forms of violence against revenue collectors and people of the IRS at that time, 1940s, 1950s, because most of the American tax resistors, the strategy was mainly constitutional. They had to prove that the income tax was unconstitutional, and so they were less interested with direct and physical contacts with members of the IRS at the time. So similarity but differences between the two movements. Just a last word, and to finish with the Mavericks time, 1940s, 1950s. What is striking is that at that time, few people took seriously the two movements in France and in the US. That's Pierre Poujade. And many people in France accused him of being a demagogue, and you have many famous quotations about the Poujadisme. He was presented as a crazy fascist, paranoid person, and all the people surrounding him was presented the same way. François Mitterrand, who will become French president in the 80s, used the expression fascism of shopkeepers to describe the Poujade and his supporters. And that's not a right wing, but that's center-oriented newspaper, L'Express in France, always refer to Pierre Poujade as Poujadolf, mixing Pierre Poujade and Adolf Hitler. So that was the way he was portrayed in a movement. And I think the same in the United States. I mean, I don't have time to dwell on the Goldwater campaign and the way it was portrayed in the press, but there is a picture I really like. That's a picture of Walt Disney receiving the Medal of Freedom, and he has a button on of showing his support for Goldwater. And many people in the press say that he was an old man, a little bit crazy. I mean, because he was just receiving the medal from the hands of Lyndon Johnson with a Goldwater return campaign in 1964. So, and just one more thing, I think at that time, the social scientists, 1950s, 1960s, still perceived and analyzed the American right in with a psychological paradigm. I mean, it was just following the analysis of what happened in Germany in 1930s. They just saw that the people supporting Senator McCarthy or being opposed to taxation as crazy and paranoid people. Everything changed, I think, in the early 1970s. You have similar movements. Sometimes you have more people, but I think the way tax resistance was perceived changed both in the United States and in France. In France, the most famous movement, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was very, very famous in France in the 70s. His name is Gérard Nicou. I have a picture of, no, I don't have it. Gérard Nicou, and he was a café, the French typical café owner in Grenoble, southeast of France. And he became very famous in the 70s, Gérard Nicou. He protested against a business tax called La Patente, and it's tax which dated back from the French Revolution, so very, very old tax. And he was one of the first to protest against it. And he launched a movement called Unity, which still exists today. You can find it on the website. We still have a website. And the movement was first, it was quite popular in the southeast of France. And in some places like Bretagne, it was also very popular, but mainly in the southeast of France. And what characterized the movement was first, it was very violent. It was more violent than Pierre Poujade and that the Pierre Poujade's movement was. It was a very violent movement, and the Nicou and his supporters physically attacked revenue officers. They like to call them at their home. I mean, they give them phone calls and telling them they sing a very small song. I won't sing it for you, but it's a very small song telling tax collectors that you know everything about us, but we know everything about you. We know where you send your kids, when your kids are, what you are doing every day. So take care, small tax collectors. We could take care of you. And so you have many revenue offices were attacked by the Gérard Nicou's supporters at that time between 1970 and 1975. But what is very striking, and what was very striking at the time, was that there was a new legitimacy for the movement. And for the first time, I mean, first in the press, I mean, journalists portray Nicou and his supporters in a different way than they presented Poujade. And Nicou was told to have good reasons to oppose the tax system, the tax burden. It appeared in the French press. You also have politicians who started to welcome Nicou and his supporters. And for instance, the French president welcomed Gérard Nicou at the French White House, le Palais de l'Élysée, in 1976. And many revenue officers from the French IRS were very upset because they told the French president, I mean, this guy has attacked many of us. I mean, and he's welcomed at the Palais de l'Élysée, and he's like a hero for the French president, and it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes things very complicated for us with other taxpayers. And you also have many, and I will go back to that in a minute, many French politicians on the right who hope to tap on this Gérard Nicou's movement and to change the tax burden and to transform the tax system in the 1970s. The same occurred with the tax resistors in the U.S., an American case. After the Goldwater campaign, many tax resistors needed 4 or 5 years, I mean, to start new grassroots organization, grassroots strategy. But they changed the strategy, I mean, with more confrontation with revenue officers. And that's the time when the idea that the IRS was, as Vivian Kellems put it, was the American Gestapo. Occurred in the archives. I mean, you have very, very few mentions of the IRS before. I mean, 1940s. You have scandals, but in the tax resistors papers, I haven't seen mention of the IRS. One of the tax resistors called them the IRSS troops coming into your place, and you have more and more people who refused to pay the taxes and who were arrested in California or elsewhere. And the IRS itself started to be afraid with, there's people in conservative cycles who decided not to pay the taxes anymore. It was also more legitimate and just in a similar way than the French case. And I have a good example with Vivian Kellems. I've already mentioned her name. But she was a tax resistor from World War II to the 70s. And from the World War II to the end of the 60s, she was always portrayed in the press as a crazy woman. I mean, what she did was completely crazy. And for instance, during World War II, or even at the end of the 40s or 50s, when she said that she won't pay her taxes anymore. But in the 1970s, she started a new campaign to protest against the discriminations against single in the tax code, in the U.S. tax code. And what is was very interesting during the campaign is that she's portrayed totally differently in the press. I mean, she's seen as she's portrayed as a nice old woman with a very good crusade, and she also softened her argument against the evil of the income tax, and she said that was not exactly what she meant. But she didn't want all the taxpayers not to pay the taxes, but she just wanted to have a reflection about the tax system and who pay taxes. So you have, something in a campaign was between 1972 and 74. So something in the air changed, I think, at that time as far as tax resistors were concerned. You also have, and that's many members of the upper class and big corporation started to be influenced by a new literature on taxation and the idea of shareholders' democracy. And of course, I refer to Julia Seal's book on this idea of shareholders' democracy. And I think that for many businessmen who were out of the tax resistance movement in the 50s and 60s, because many of them have contracts with the federal government in the country or abroad, they started to change their mind. And I don't know if you have read Kim Phillips-Fein's book on the conservative movement, but she shows that even in 78, 79, 80, many businessmen were reluctant to support Ronald Reagan, and he had to convince them, and he used this argument, Laffer's argument on taxation and this idea of shareholder democracy that he was able to implement to convince them into that they have to engage the tax resistance movement. And of course, in 1978, you have this, and I think Isaac is the expert in this field, the Howard Javits movement and the movement against property taxes, which was a local movement, but which had strong national consequences for the country. And Javits, who was a previous tax resistor, I mean, he was a supporter of the Liberty Amendment in the early 1960s, but soon after his victory in California, he started a national movement against taxation, and he gave a new legitimacy to tax resistors. So I don't have time to show you the small excerpt of, that's an interview with Gérard Nicou and Philippe Gildas. Maybe there are some people who know well French politics and French television, and that's an amazing interview with Gérard Nicou and Philippe Gildas, who will become one of the most famous journalists on television in the 80s and 90s. And you have the famous cover of Tuck magazine with a tax revolt and Javits on it. What happened afterwards? I mean, and that's the moment where I think at the end of 70s and early 80s, the tax resistance movement had different trends in France and the United States. The first thing in France, many in 1978, and I mentioned many of them in the papers that maybe you have read for today, but intellectuals and politicians hope to tap on Nicou's movement. I mean, to create a large movement of taxpayers against the burden of national taxes in France. And Jacques Chirac, he was the prime minister in 74, 76, and he hoped to be the candidate of the right in 1981. He soon accepted the idea of becoming the taxpayers' champ. I mean, he was very influenced by what happened in the United States, and he wanted to be the Ronald Reagan, I mean the French Ronald Reagan at that time. And as I will show you, changed his mind. And he used the network of the small business corporations and the PME in France, Petites et Moyennes Entreprises in France, to launch this movement, this pocketbook movements, including many citizens against taxation. But it failed in 1981 with the election of the socialist president, François Mitterrand. And afterwards, after 1981, I mean, the tax resistance movement was marginalized. And Jacques Chirac always tried to be the taxpayers' champ, but he always failed, to implement new tax policy, and he failed to be elected president in 1988. And that's after this defeat, 1988 defeat, he decided to give up on this taxpayers ID and tax cuts ID, and to become and to defend the French model, the French Keynesian model. And in 1995 and in 2002, he was elected president, as the and promised to defend the French model. And what happened was this tax resistance movement, this ideological movement, was it was the only legacy was to be found on the extreme right. And Le Front National, the extreme right party in France, after 1986, was the only party in France defending, the taxpayers' cause and the tax cuts IDs. And that's no coincidence, because Jean-Marie Le Pen, as you probably know, was elected in 1955 with Pierre Poujad's troops at that time. So there was a very, very strong connection between the two. And it was not so, but and I use the word marginalization, but it was not marginalized. It wasn't. The French National, for the Front National, was one of the major parties in France in the 1990s and 2000. But it was seen as by many politicians and by many French people as on the margin of French politics, and many people refused to vote for the Front National. I think in the United States you have a very interesting connection between ideological resistance movement and pocketbook resistors. And in the 1970s, the two merged and led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And I think the 1978 election were crucial in this merger between the two movements, and more people were convinced about the idea that taxes were unfair. And just to give you an example, in 1976, President Jimmy Carter called the tax code a disgrace. So you have this idea that even if it was not a conservative, but this idea that something was wrong with the tax code, and so it convinced citizens to be pocketbook resistors and to have this idea that it was unfair, and to join the ideological tax parade. What happened afterwards, and that's just to launch the debate and Isaac's comments. As I told you, the tax resistance movement, this ideological movement, was captured by Jean-Marie Le Pen and the Front National in 1990s and 2000s, but French presidential candidate Nicolas Sarkozy, when he tried to capture the people who voted for Jean-Marie Le Pen, went back to the Ronald Reagan's rhetoric of 1980 and captured this ideological resistance, and he was elected on the idea that he will be the tax cutter in chief, as some people call Reagan, in 1985, and that's what he tried to do before the economic crisis. But in 2007, he was elected on the idea that he will be the president that ideological resistors expected in the 1970s. I think let's go back to what happened after Reagan, and to if I follow this idea of ideological and pocketbook resistance, and to go back maybe with some ideas about the Tea Party movement today. The idea in the book is that Reagan's tax policy, Reagan tried to first to reassure pocketbook resistors. And many people, Elliot Brownlee, for instance, showed that the 1985's tax reform was not a big tax cuts reform, but it was only to reassure the middle-class taxpayers And afterwards, you have, for instance, 1988, during the Clinton administration, you also have, new taxpayers' bills of rights, just to reassure them that they have to pay the taxes and the tax code was fair. And so that's what you don't have anymore. Maybe today is that those pocketbook resistors, stopped complaining and about the tax code and agree on the idea that it was fair tax code and that everybody was paying a share. But you also have, meanwhile, and that's what part of Reagan's legacy and Bush's junior legacy, you have some tax code for the wealthiest people in the country. And so today, and that's my argument in the last chapter of my book, what you have today, and maybe you could disagree with that, but the Tea Party movement today is the legacy of the middle class movement, which started after World War II. You have the same discontented ideological resistors. But they are part of the middle class, and they felt that they have been trapped by Reagan's, promise in 1980, or by Bush's junior promises to reform the tax code and to implement tax cuts. So there is a very, very strong legacy, and I don't have time to dwell on that, but I'm struck by, the same metaphor, the same parade and the same ideas between the two movements. The Tea Party movement today and the movement of the 1970s, those very small organizations in California and its southern states, with the same historical references, the first mention of the Tea Party bags and all that, started in the 1970s, as a political tool. And so that's, મે you could disagree, and I hope you disagree with me, that's, I think there is a close connection between the middle class resistors of the 1950s and 60s and today's Tea Party movement. As a conclusion, and just to enlarge the perspective, why is it important to study tax resistance? Per se, and also in comparative perspective. First, I think that many studies on taxation and that's good, but they're focused on the construction of fiscal states. Tax experts and the way the government, the state in France or in the US, have tried to create an efficient tax system, and sometimes the idea of resistance, as I define it, is missing. To understand the construction of the tax, the fiscal state, both in France and in the US. The second reason to study tax resistance in comparative perspective is that both French people and American people think they are exceptional in their tax hatred. That they really don't tax. That's something, that's part of the DNA. The French DNA and the American DNA. We don't like to pay taxes. That's a long tradition in France, and there is also a very, very long tradition in the US of people who don't like to pay taxes. That's the way we are. So when you compare Vivian Kellams and Pierre Poujade or Gérard Nicou, you have very, very interesting similarities between the two movements. Third reason, I think that's part of my project as an historian. To write a kind of social history of institutions. I think most of the time historians tend to write in histories of taxation or of poverty, of social issues, from the lens of policymakers and experts and politicians. And what I try to do, and it's very difficult, I try to write it from the angle of the people. The way taxpayers, citizens perceived the taxation. It's easier in France, in US, and in France because, and that's very interesting as a comparison. In France, the only archives available for the people who study Poujade and Gérard are official archives, coming from the federal government, the state. And in the US, I don't have it, and many people don't have access to, it's very difficult to have access to the archives of the IRS, which is a very, very secret, highly protected archives. And so you have, to find them in and Isaac also knows well, those very small collections. And so you have no choice but looking at it from the perspective of small organizations, small associations, individuals. So that's a very different story. And a good friend of mine is a sociologist in France. His name is Alexis Pire, and he writes a book on Gérard Nicou. And it was funny because we had a seminar together, and it was a opposite perspective. He had a perspective from the French government, which was looking at tax resistors, and I have no choice but looking at from the perspective of tax resistors themselves. And just to finish and to launch Isaac's comment and discussion, I think tax history, anti-tax history is very important. Because that's part of a larger reflection on democracy and both in France and the United States. So that's why I think maybe it could be interesting to study taxation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So we'll now hear from Isaac Martin. Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on this paper. Thank you, Romain, for the paper. Romain's paper uncovers important commonalities of the post-war tax protesters in the U.S. and France, and many of the parallels are really striking, much more striking even than I think we knew based on the prior literature. Comparative research like this, I think, is critically important for exactly some of the reasons that Romain said, overturning ideas of exceptionalism that have circulated on both sides of the Atlantic. Scholars in both France and the U.S. have often imagined that their own country is uniquely afflicted with tax protest. The former Finance Minister Gabriel Attal, in his magisterial 1965 treatise on the comparative sociology of taxation, called France the chosen land of tax revolts. And many of us in the United States have imagined that the same is true of our own country. And it's nice to see these myths debunked. The paper also uses comparison for contrast, nicely highlighting some interesting cultural differences, the obsessive constitutionalism of the American tax protesters, for example, who often insisted on very, I'll say, tortured interpretations of the Constitution in order to legitimate their actions, in contrast to some protesters like Nicou, who and his followers who beat up tax collectors with no pretense of legality. It's very interesting and has a lot, I think, to tell us about politics and society in France and the United States. Finally, the paper uses contrast to explain what we might call the mainstreaming of tax protest in the United States at the end of the 20th century and its marginalization, or perhaps not marginalization, but its different incorporation into the political system in France. And the key figure here is obviously Ronald Reagan, as we just heard, whose rhetorical embrace of neoliberal ideology and of Arthur Laffer's supply-side doctrine in particular gave tax protesters legitimacy. I'm going to raise some questions about this part of the argument in particular in a moment. But before I do, I want to explain why I think this part of the argument is actually itself very important. The first generation of comparative research on the right-wing tax protesters of the post-war era had almost nothing to say about ideology. It was carried out within the problematic of modernization theory, and sociologists like Seymour, Martin, Lipset explained Poujadisme and American right-wing radicalism with reference to the changing class structure. This was supposed to be the last desperate cry of a declining petty bourgeoisie, threatened by modernity, the shopkeeper against the department store. Ardant even documented a geographic correlation between the areas of the greatest resistance by the Poujadists and areas of peasant tax protests in the 14th century, in order to argue that the movement still represented backward provincial France, that even in the 1950s was just being incorporated somehow into the market economy. This interpretation squared with what was then a leading interpretation of the social base of fascism, which is one reason why scholars thought Poujade was very important to understand. And in fact, Poujadism became a kind of generic term for shopkeepers' right-wing militancy in the comparative literature. The trouble with this interpretation, of course, was that it was wrong. The petty bourgeoisie was not actually declining in the face of advancing industry. As Romain's paper points out, quite the contrary is true. French shopkeepers were multiplying at the time. And the image of Poujade crisscrossing the French countryside in his book delivery van to organize demonstrations is not, after all, much like the image of a peasant who has yet to be integrated into the market economy. Later scholarship pointed to administrative modernization, not economic modernization, to explain why protest broke out in this period. And in this group, I would include scholars like Dominique Born, the journalist Robert Kuttner, and with apologies, my own comparative research on French and American tax rebels. The observation that motivated all of these studies is that various forms of tax cheating in the early post-war era were not only rampant, but semi-officially tolerated as a kind of under-the-table subsidy, until administrative reforms finally centralized and standardized the assessment and collection of taxes. The French shopkeepers in Sancerre did not protest when the department store came to town. They protested when the tax assessor came to town. And the reason that they protested in 1953 is that before that, the tax assessor never insisted on looking at their books. These were rebellions in defense of kind of a customary administrative laxity, I'll say. And the same with the appropriate changes could be said of many of these American cases. Now, this is my own interpretation, and so of course I like it. But the main trouble with this interpretation, it seems to me, is that it has difficulty accounting for how these scattered and localized rebellions against particular taxes sometimes turned into a more general universalizing rejection of taxation as such. What provokes you to protest might be a particular license tax, say, or a change in the administration of a sales tax. But how do you go from protesting against that particular change to protesting against the sales tax as such, to then protesting against taxation, the legitimacy of taxation, as many Americans in the early days of the 21st century Tea Party, for example, seem to be doing? Here, I think Romain's attention to ideology has a very important contribution to make. Clearly, even pocketbook protesters have to make an ideational leap of some kind in order to connect their particular pocketbook grievances to some big abstraction like government or taxation. And clearly, too, the ideational resources they draw on to make inferences like these come from somewhere. They have a history. And it might be possible to identify particular ideas that play a role in facilitating tax protests, such as, say, the supply-side doctrine that Arthur Laffer espoused and that Ronald Reagan promulgated, the idea that cutting taxes on rich people will actually stimulate the economy enough to increase tax revenues. Romain's argument puts great weight on this particular ideology. So this line of argument, this attention to ideology, seems to me promising, but it also confronts some empirical difficulties, and I'm going to raise three critical points here. These are sort of difficulties of explaining protest with reference to ideology. The first difficulty with using ideology to explain protest is that protesters draw on ideology opportunistically and selectively. The supply-side doctrine, for example, was nothing new to these tax protesters when they heard it from Ronald Reagan. Many of them had heard it before from President Kennedy and had rejected it at that time. President Kennedy's tax rhetoric in the early 1960s, as several scholars have noted, sounds, in hindsight, a whole lot like Ronald Reagan's. And he argued for income tax cuts in the top brackets to stimulate the economy. And many right-wing tax protesters explicitly rejected this tax program as an unjust compromise with expediency. They wanted to abolish the income tax. The supply-side program at that time seemed to them like an illegitimate use of the income tax to manage the economy, rather than seeming to them like a legitimate attempt to reduce government intervention in the economy. But then many veterans of these same movements, like Howard Jarvis, embraced the very same supply-side doctrine when the Reagan administration used it to justify a very similar tax program in 1981. So the availability of supply-side rhetoric cannot have been sufficient to account for how American tax resistors built this larger movement after the 1980s, during and after the Reagan years, because that rhetoric had been available earlier without that effect. The second difficulty here with ideological explanations like this is that protesters, even within the same movement, are often an ideologically heterogeneous bunch. Take the Pujavists. In the early days of the movement, as Stanley Hoffman's research showed, the most active protesters actually included many communists alongside anti-communists like Pujav. Now, there were no communists openly involved in the American tax protests of the 1950s, of course. And this is another important cross-national difference. But there were other unorthodox radicals. Frank Chodorov, the author of The Income Tax Root of All Evil, which was sort of the Bible of the movement in 1954, once threatened to punch someone in the nose for calling him conservative. He insisted he was a radical, and he was, in fact, an unreconstructed single taxer. Went to his grave insisting on the rightness of the ideas of Henry George, that heterodox economist of the 19th century, whose program called for taxing away the speculative increment on land values, and which we usually think of, at least in the American context, as having been a program of, at least for a time, the labor left. So because tax protesters are ideologically diverse, it seems hard to argue that any particular ideology is necessary to explain the spread of tax protest in the late 20th century. So if a particular ideology is neither sufficient nor necessary, we have to wonder then what its role in the explanation is. Now, I know I've gone on a bit long, but I want to mention one last final difficulty with explanations like this. And here I think this is the piece that might seem the most provocative. So I don't want to leave it out, which is that protesters sometimes use the rhetoric of tax protest to make demands that have nothing to do with taxes. And just as importantly, sometimes use other forms of rhetoric to make demands that are about taxes. So we may be misled into thinking that a particular rhetoric or ideology explains protest, when really we're just observing the relatively superficial cultural difference that protesters use a particular language of taxation to describe their protest. I think a little thought experiment here will clarify my point, and then I'll conclude. Imagine that some brave or foolhardy government introduces a proposal to increase Social Security contributions at the same time that it's cutting Social Security benefits. Imagine that it happens simultaneously in France and the United States. What happens next? I think we know, or we can guess. In the United States, I think it's very easy to imagine the furor that would erupt. No new Social Security taxes. I think it's also very easy to imagine the protest that would erupt in France. Defend our Social Security. If I'm right, we would see a very similar reaction with very different slogans. And we might be tempted to say that there had been a tax protest in the United States, but a pro-welfare state, pro-Social Security protest in France. This thought experiment is easy, I think, of course, because things very much like this have actually happened in the late 20th century, indeed, if we acknowledge that something like this might count as a tax protest, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that there's been quite a lot of tax protest in France in the late 20th century, most of it associated with unions in the left, and associated with, in fact, the defense of the Social Security system against austerity reforms that would have cut benefits and increased taxes. Now, in conclusion, though, I'm not sure that I accept Romain's premise that tax protest was actually more widespread in the US than France in the late 20th century. I certainly accept the argument that the rhetoric of tax protest was more legitimate in the United States. And indeed, I think tax protest has become an almost obligatory rhetorical posture on the American right, perhaps especially among Republican officials who are not actually protesting but governing. This is a genuine cultural transformation. It's genuinely puzzling. It's weird. And I think Romain is also right to identify the Reagan administration as a turning point. I think the role of rhetoric and ideology, and perhaps culture more generally in tax protest, is a very important one and a very difficult one to demonstrate empirically. I think Romain is absolutely correct that if we're going to understand the comparative history of tax protest, we will need to wade into these waters. But they are deep and treacherous waters. And so I'm glad that Romain is wading in first. Thank you.
Of course, one of the greatest compliments that somebody can have is for a reader of one's paper to take it as seriously and make as helpful criticisms as Isaac has. So thank you very much. But I do feel like I should give you a chance to respond, so perhaps you would like to do that, and then we can open the floor to questions and comments.
Oh, very, very briefly, so I'm sure we will have many times and many hours to discuss with Isaac later. First about the ideology as the role of ideology. I don't think that we have to look at it in a very coherent way. I mean, something very structured and very coherent in this middle class movements. I mean, we have to accept that sometimes people and people's ideas are not rational. If you look at Poujade, if you read Poujade, it's very, very difficult, and nobody is able to do that. I mean, to have a clear sense of what he meant in terms of ideology, and that's why you have so many different interpretations of Poujadisme among scholars, because it's not so coherent. I mean, he was not an intellectual. He didn't want to be an intellectual. I mean, and that the same with many tax resistors in the U.S. I mean, Vivian Callams, for instance, wrote many books and articles on taxation. And when you read that, I mean, it's not always very, very coherent. I mean, in terms of ideology, and that's not an intellectual movement. So to go back to your example of the surplus-side economist and what they brought to the conversation, I think the world was limited at the time. I mean, even if the Wall Street Journal was the place when you can read their ideas, but it was quite limited. And there was, as you mentioned, I agree with you that there are just an influence on a very, very small proportion of policymakers and businessmen. I mean, that's Philip's fine arguments in our book. I mean, it's not nobody really understood what Laffer meant at the time, or even among the Republican Party, but for a very small numbers of very powerful businessmen and big corporation owners, I mean, it was quite important. But there was absolutely, and I agree with you, there was nothing new. I mean, if you read all that literature and small conservative organization, we have the same idea already there in the 50s or 60s. About the Kennedy's tax cuts and Kennedy's ideas, the more I'm plunged into my chapter on 40s and 50s and 60s, the more I'm convinced that Kennedy's idea of tax cuts was quite important for big corporations. And that's one, I mean, when I first wrote my chapter on World War II, and I was, into this idea that it was the reconciliation between businessmen and the New Deal, and the more I read and the more I discussed with colleagues, I just found out that businessmen were very, very happy with the tax code implemented in World War II. I mean, they got exactly what they want. I mean, the tax expert Carl Schrupp, wrote that in 1946. Businessmen got exactly what they expected. In 1946. So it was not this what Vivian Callams called high tax Harry. It was not the case for businessmen. So that's why those corporations, this big corporation, they were not part of the tax resistance movement as they were in the 1930s. The big corporation, the 2 or 3 the biggest corporation in the country, and that's what it was. Middle class movement composed only of small owners and middle class businessmen and businesswomen. So there was something very important, which occurred with the Kennedys and Democrats, liberals' agreement with businessmen at the time. About the diversity argument you made, and you're right, that's a good argument. It's always difficult. When you write, you need to find to write something very very unified for the reader. You have to give argument, and you're right. The movement both in France and the US is quite diverse, but Meanwhile, I mean, you're right to mention the role of communists in 1953, but very, very soon, I mean, they went away. I mean, they left the Poujade movement. I mean, they understood that it was a very right-wing movement, and speeches of Poujade for the Algérie française and in favor of colonization, in favor of the French Empire, as pushed away. I mean, communists who not identified with anymore with the Poujade movement. So, right, I have to take care of and maybe try to be more subtle in my presentation of the diversity of tax resistors. And one last, before opening the floor for questions, about was it more legitimate in the U.S. than in France? I mean, you seem to disagree with that. I mean, that there was it was only a question of rhetoric. You're right, but I think the only problem is in the 1990s and 2000, and in the French case, is the fact that the only political party which was opposed to taxation was the Front National. Strongly opposed to taxation was the party of the taxpayers against the elites, the people from Lyon, was the Front National, and it's a very, very specific case. I mean, you don't have this kind of rejected party. I mean, Jean-Marie Le Pen was not invited on television, on radio. I mean, it was it's a very, very specific case, and that's why I have this argument about the marginalization because it was captured by the right wing and the strengths and the powerful idea of Nicolas Sarkozy was to bring back, I mean, all those small organization of taxpayers, all the organization of small businessmen into the field of the French legitimate right, the RPR and l'UMP, because they were, most of them were very, very disillusioned by Jacques Chirac. I mean, when he was president in 1995 and 2002, I mean, he used to be the taxpayers' champ, and when he was president, he said, "I'm over with that, and now I will defend the French model, the French Keynesian model, and I won't touch the reform the tax system as he promised 20 years ago." I mean, in the paper, I conclude by, and I was a kid at that time, but I remember my mother showed me that on television. But Jacques Chirac, when he was the mayor of Paris, invited Arthur Laffer in Paris. Laffer was in Paris, and Jacques Chirac was very proud of having him in Paris, and he told French journalists and French audience that Laffer was the most brilliant economist in the United States, and we need to have more economists like him in France. I mean, he was the future of the country. So for many people, I mean, all the people who followed Jacques Chirac, I mean, it was quite a disillusion. I mean, he's 12 years as president of the French president. I mean, in the field of taxation. I mean, in comparison to what he promised when he was a mayor and he was a candidate. So that's why maybe I won't change what I said. But thank you so much for your, as usual, your very brilliant comments.
We can open the floor to comments and questions.
Great presentation and great comments. Thank you both. I think just on this issue of the mainstreaming versus kind of siphoning off to the extreme right of tax protest, I was wondering if, in fact, an even broader comparative perspective might help us here, because at least the little that I know about tax protests in other Western European countries, you see a similar thing in Denmark, for example, where the anti-taxers are siphoned off into the extreme right. And so maybe the big difference between the US and the European countries is that in the US, the extreme right kind of gets into on the right side of the cordon sanitaire because there are only two parties. And so one of them gets to be the extreme right, and that's the Republicans, whereas in the multi-party systems that you have in Europe, you know, there's space for the division of this kind of extreme right versus the respectable right or the center-right parties. And I was wondering if either of you had any comments as to whether that might be a plausible interpretation of how the U.S. ended up looking different from potentially similar kind of tax resistance on the right movements.
Maybe maybe you want to answer? Maybe an expert on Danish fiscal policy?
Well, I'll just say I think I agree. I actually do think that's the story. The Herbert Kitschult's work on the right-wing parties in Europe shows, right, that many of these small parties sort of began as tax protest vehicles and then found that was a short-lived and small coalition, and so started bringing in the xenophobes and the nativists, basically to keep their numbers up, right? But that this was sort of a common pattern in many cases. Denmark is the clear one, where the trajectory is very similar from tax protest of the Progress Party into into a sort of more broad-based racist party. Anyway.
Just very briefly, I mean, the French case with the election of Nicolas Sarkozy showed that we can have a multi-party system, and mainstream party, as the UMP is, with a very, very strong critique of the tax system, and with a rhetoric similar. I mean, I was struck 4 years ago when Nicolas Sarkozy was candidate. I mean, I started working on this book, and I mean, it was exactly, I mean, the same quotation used by Reagan in 1980. I mean, Sarkozy used the same words, I mean, the same expression, that you work 180 days a year to pay for your taxes, and exactly the same rhetoric and the same sentence. So,
well, first, thanks to both of you. It was an excellent paper and wonderful comment, and we have a good debate going. I'd like to make 2 points. The first has to do with the function of the tax system. You, Romain, portrayed the essential ideological function as one of Keynesian regulation of the economy. But taxation, from a general point of view, can be presented in another light as the support of a redistributive state. And it seems to me that a large part of the emotional content of tax protests in the United States has been objection to the nature of the welfare state, to the feeling on the part of those who see themselves as the primary payers of the income tax, which is our primary tax, that their money is being used to help others who are different from them in some way. So the racial issues of politics come into play here. And I think perhaps you emphasize that aspect, and might call attention to a difference, if you see one, between that aspect of American tax protest and French tax protest. The other point I would make has to do with abstraction from the specific nature of the taxes being paid. France doesn't have a major income tax. It has an income tax that claims a much smaller share of income than the American tax. And the American income tax is peculiar in its structure in that a fairly substantial segment of the population is exempted from the income tax. So that it is essentially a middle-class tax. And this reinforces my first point. The middle class does not see the benefits that it receives from the tax system, because many of them come in the form of tax expenditures, such as the mortgage tax deduction. So the middle class receives a transfer payment through the tax system, but it doesn't see it as a transfer payment supported by the tax system. In France, the primary tax that was under attack was the patente, which is a very categorical tax. It's not paid universally. So it lends itself to a kind of a fragmentary protest, not a protest that is generalizable in the sense of American tax protest. So I would see that as another contrast. So there are 2 comments on your presentations, and ask you to react to them.
Yes, I agree. I think I agree with you, and I don't have the time to I do more in the paper, but you're right. I mean, we have to look at, I mean, difference of taxes, and you're absolutely right that the income tax structure is different in France and the United States. But meanwhile, I'm not sure that, and I'm talking after Gérard Nicot's protest, but I think in France, since the 1980s, you have what happened in the United States. I mean, this middle class which was discontented was the fact that they paid for social services they will never benefit from. It also occurred in France. I mean, in the 1990s and 2000s, and Nicolas Sarkozy today, taps on this idea that you have a lot of frauds, and it was his argument in 2007 election, and if you have read the French press today, it seems to be his new one of these new parts of this program, to accuse some people of cheating on social services, and meanwhile, middle class who work a lot and who pay taxes, will never benefit from programs. So that's quite unfair. So yes, it was. We need more time in France. To have this kind of reaction toward the tax system, because I think in the 80s, and that's explained the victory of François Mitterrand. He was able to use this tax discontent, tax protest, and to recreate the French redistributive state. As it was created after World War II. It was the idea of the French resistance to create a government state. Ruled by social justice and social and fiscal justice after World War II. And the idea of François Mitterrand was to go back to this idea. To recreate the fiscal state on the ground of a better redistribution between the elites and the people. And so he tapped. He was very close from Jarnicou, for instance. And then there is a small anecdote. I don't know if you're familiar with the comedian named Coluche in France, who wanted to be elected president in 1981. And he was supposed to be candidate with Jarnicou to have, and François Mitterrand convinced Coluche and Jarnicou not to run on the same platform, but to help him to become president. So François Mitterrand, used this discontent in different ways that some ideological resistors expected.
Somebody back there have
Oh,
yeah.
I did before, yeah. No, I'm,
Maybe you want to answer what Arthur? Sorry.
Sure. I'll jump in. Yeah, sure. So yeah, yes. I think the attention to the particulars of the tax
are probably pretty important for understanding how on the one hand, how sort of anger over a particular tax comes to be generalized. And a good example here from Coleman's paper is the Marshall housewives of Marshall, Texas, Carolyn Abney and her friends, who were outraged that they had to pay payroll tax on the wages of their domestic servants. Well, that became part of a more generalized tax protest, in part because they were supposed to remit that together on their personal income tax return, and remit it with their personal income tax. So it somehow got bundled together as a transaction. And I think this attention to the actual properties of the transaction may help. Another example, I think it would be very easy for me to be smug about, having paid taxes for many years and never been tempted to pull a Poujade, I never got that mad, never. But he's crazy. But I've lived for 38 years and I've never been face to face with a tax collector who has demanded entrance to my space to look at my books, right? And I think attention to these ritual properties of the interaction, where the fact that sort of you have to look someone in the eye and subordinate yourself to them must be part of the story.
I think they're much more physically present in France. You see tax collectors' offices in every town.
which created a lot of opportunities for Niku and his buddies.
Just wait till you're on it.
Well, this is actually a great transition into because I wanted to talk about the violence, right? So you're right. So there's, I'm familiar with the French case, but this violence against tax collectors, you're right. The American far right has this sort of fascinating obsession with legalism and the Constitution and all these sort of pseudo-legal theories they cook up. And it's remarkable that they do not take more violent action against IRS employees. However, violence and the threat of violence is very much a part of their repertoire. It's been directed towards federal judges, towards people that work for Department of Interior or the EPA. There was a census worker that was murdered a couple years ago. I think that's still unsolved, but...
And a plane was flown into an IRS office.
Well, yeah, so there's an example, but it's... of course, this is maybe a little bit after your analysis time. I think the boom time for this kind of violence really sort of started in the 80s and then took off in the 90s, the McVeigh bombing being the most extreme example. But I wonder if the argument, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but the argument is that this sort of violence delegitimized French anti-tax rhetoric. That's not, you're shaking your head, so maybe I'm incorrectly assuming that was your argument. In this sense, maybe the American anti-tax movement got sort of lucky because the violence on the extreme right wasn't really associated with, Reagan's tax rhetoric per se. I wonder what your reaction to that would be.
Well, it's not exactly what I'm saying. I think, and that's kind of paradox for the 1970s in France, because you have on one side a very violent movement, and Jean Nicot was very, very violent, and his followers were also very violent, but it was a legitimate movement, and that's a kind of paradox between 1970 and 75. And judges, for instance, they understood. They say, okay, it's not good to attack a revenue collector or to threaten his family, but I understand what you want to do, so you won't go to jail. And you have the friend of mine who writes his book on Jean Nicot has a lot of example of this. The way judges, but also journalists and in the local press or the national press and politicians, they understood the violence of the movement, and that was new. They didn't for Poujade. Poujade was a fascist. It was the same violence than in Germany in 1930s, but not for Jean Nicot. They understood that. They argued that this violence was legitimate because there was something wrong with the French. Treasury secretary to the French fiscal system. There was something wrong, and maybe revenue collectors had to change what they did when they went into taxpayers' home and asked him for his books of account. And so they were the tax collectors and were guilty of what happened. They was responsible with this rise of violence, not taxpayers and Nicot's and his followers. So that's something quite. And I gave the example of the French President Valéry d'Estaing welcoming Jean Nicot at the Élysée. And inviting him for lunch and explaining to on television that he understood. Jean Nicot was all the time on the French television. Comparing the French. Fiscal administration to the Gestapo, the same words than Vivian Callams. So it was very violent, but legitimate. That's so I'm not sure. Maybe you're right. I've never thought about it. About that. Maybe in the American case, with the exception of some very specific violence against tax resistors, it was not something which was associated with the tax resistance. Violence was not associated with the tax resistance movement, and maybe explain why it was more legitimate. I don't know what you need to say about that.
I don't know. I don't know. Not sure. Noted thoughts.
Have you met cases of violence?
There aren't as many, and I think the lesser presence of sort of physical direct one-on-one interaction with tax collectors may be part of the story in the U.S. There are some, and it looms large in the consciousness of IRS collectors because it's a real threat that they think they face. An odd book called Confessions of a Tax Collector by Richard Yancey, where he talks about some experiences of basically going to collect from a small business owner who's behind on his payments, going to repossess or not repossess, but to put a lien on the property or seize the property or something. I don't know the legal term is, I don't know.
Excellent.
Yeah. And being confronted with violence. So I guess it's a big part of the experience, or at least looms large in the awareness of some tax collectors in the U.S., but there are perhaps so many fewer tax collectors in the U.S. that it's...
Yeah, this is a terrific seminar. That sounds like a terrific paper, and I want to sort of take you back to what the causal factors are for this move. So you've told a very nice story about how these social activists, as an expression of an ideology, move from sort of the lunatic fringe to a certain amount of mainstream legitimacy. And ideology seems to be doing a lot of work for you here. And I'm wondering how you kind of reconcile that with the conventional historiography, at least in the American context, which is really much more a broader story about changes in the political economy. Right, that the period from 45 to the mid 70s and 80 are sort of your pivot period, right, when things really get moving. And so the standard historiography, and you know this work, we've talked Eliot Brownlee's work and Gene Sterlier, and this is the era of easy finance because this is the age of golden age of American capitalism, right? That things are going well, objectively GNP is good, and so they're really, most people are along for the ride because so what if I'm paying 70% top marginal rate, right? Things are still pretty good, my disposable. Things dramatically changed in the 70s with stagflation and the complete end of that. And so the conventional story in the American context is that this ideology, yeah, there's seeds of it all over, but the real causal factor is a much larger, broader structural change in not just American political economy, right? This affects, I don't know the French case very well, but I imagine that there might be a similar explanation in France. I wonder how you square I commend you for doing the social history. You're absolutely right. It's a highly labor-intensive process, and we need to know more about some of these. But as far as the actual causal explanations that we can give, I wonder how you kind of square the social history and the political economies.
The way I try to bring that, the more structural economic and political factors of the 1970s is through pocketbook resistors. They were the ones who changed their mind. They accepted to pay their taxes from World War II to the end of the 60s and 70s, and suddenly they had a problem with taxation, with the IRS, and with the tax policy because of the changing factors you just mentioned, and that's where the moment where the connection occurred. Between ideological resistance and pocketbook resistance. That's you have in my book, starting with the Civil War, you have this very, very long process of this ideological resistance, a very, very long process, and you have the same constitutional, economic arguments against taxation. Which is federal taxation, which are wrong, and but sometimes. I mentioned in my paper in the 1930s. You have very, very strong argument, the upper class explaining to the American people in 1935, during the 1936 presidential election, they explained that it's wrong for the economy, it's wrong for the American citizens, that it will be a nightmare and that you will lose a lot of money, and most of the people voted we elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So that's, as I mentioned, it's not automatic. You can have strong ideology against taxation, and you could have, so you need to bring those structural and political factors which lead some citizens, to enter the tax, an anti-tax parade. I'm not sure if maybe.
Nothing. I got nothing.
I'd like to kind of build off of Art's comments a little bit, but sort of raise the question of exceptionalism. And if exceptionalism has such a bad connotation these days, you can't really use it.
Peculiarity.
But I wonder if there's specificities that are really at work here in the American case, that there is a difference between what's going on in Europe in general and the American situation. And that France has some specific things about France that make it a little bit different than other places in Europe, but it's basically behaving in a European way. And here, I just would invoke a couple of ideas to make that case. One is that there are, I think, two moments in the story of the American narrative that you've told that you haven't really emphasized, but I think are really also very important. One is Proposition 13, the Jarvis thing, but that is namely property tax. The extent to which the tax narrative is deeply embedded in the particular history of the way people have responded to and the function of and the difficulties and the inequalities that are built into a system of taxation that depends so much for property tax for education. It's completely different in Europe. And then the second is the Bush tax cuts of 2000, which I think have been really crucial in structuring the current situation. Because that was a very interesting moment in which there was a state surplus. My God, the Clinton surplus, but then got completely liquidated by that, and we're still struggling over that. So that there's a specific history around taxation in the United States that really differs from Western Europe in general. Now, the French situation is very. I'd just be interested if anybody knows more. My guess is that the French situation, namely the Poujade story and the Nicou story, are quite unusual, and that they're quite specifically sociological and political, and they come out of the traditions of tax reform and the peculiarities of the system of modernizing the tax system and the revolts against that. And they always remained fairly sociologically contained, and their violence was, yes, it was violent, but it was also very ritualized violence. I mean, even the Nicou stuff is really drawing on the rituals. They're not really going out and assassinating people. And this is going on in a Europe where people are assassinating people in the 1970s in Italy and Germany and so on. So that it all is kind of, and there's this tradition of pretty violent stuff in agricultural revolts in the 1960s. I mean, people know how to go in and bust up people and hurt some people, but they never kill anybody. So that there's an American, and the argument is there's an American and the European story, and then there's a twist on the European story, which is the French story.
You also?
Sure. Maybe. So there are. I mean, the other European cases I can think of and it's the Scandinavian tax revolts of the early 70s. So Mogens Glistrup in Denmark, and then a sort of spin-off imitator movement in Norway in 1973. And here's a tax lawyer who sort of goes on TV and tells everybody that it's legitimate to cheat on your taxes. And Danes who lived through this era remember that because it's like the most shocking thing you could have said on Danish TV in the 1970s. But then started this amazing protest movement, and it had absolutely to do with the modernization of the Danish income tax administration. That's the first moment when Danes actually implemented income tax withholding at source, and it was this big shift in how the tax was administered and collected, and small employers in particular freaked out, to use a technical term. And that seems, I guess, a lot like the Poujade story to me, with the exception that some of these specific agrarian sort of rituals of protest you're talking about, that's not what they do in Denmark. Instead, they do stuff that look like, they do these demonstrations that look like pop concerts. I mean, it's a very, and it's a younger crowd, and it's, so they're drawing on sort of other cultural forms in that context. The American stuff, I'll say a puzzle about. I mean, I think the Jarvis experience is very important. I'll just add a puzzle about the American property tax, which is most of the sort of political economy theories we have of local property taxation seem to imply that it should be the most popular tax because it's local, and so it goes to your kids' schools rather than being taken by the federal government and spent on other people's kids. It thereby increases the value of your home because you pay taxes for good schools. Having good schools is great for you. And so there have been these quite formal theories arguing basically that the property tax should be, of all taxes, the local property tax should be the very most popular one, and yet demonstrably not. And I think we're grappling with, and I'm not sure there's a good sort of yet general theory of. I mean, there are a lot of things that might be about the property tax that make people hate it in the American context, and So there are a lot of candidates for what makes that odious. I'm not sure we know why. I'll use the opportunity to add one more American peculiarity, and this is actually, I think, returns to a question that was raised earlier about violence and legitimacy and so on. Because we've been contrasting the violence of of Niku to the sort of constitutionalism and legal consciousness of the American protesters. That constitutionalism and legal consciousness, this idea that in order to argue against the income tax, you always have to find a reason why it's unconstitutional, shows up again and again in the late 20th century and in the 21st century. And it always, and this is, I'm going out on a limb, I don't have a good theory of how this happens, but it always reminds me of a very Protestant approach to interpretation. Sola scriptura. Right? You say, in order to know the law, you don't need to know anything about the law. You go back to the original text, and it's between you and that text. And if you don't see income tax written in the Constitution, then by God, it's not constitutional. It's a discourse that's just throughout these movements. So I'll add another weird speculation to the list.
I think you're absolutely right, Isaac, because in the U.S. case, I mean, people who oppose taxation, I mean, they did it in the name of the Constitution. In France, tax resistors, what they wanted to do and still want to do is to change the Constitution and the regime. I mean, that's Jean-Marie Le Pen or many Niku, Poujade. I mean, they wanted to change the Fourth Republic or Jean-Marie Le Pen, the Fifth Republic. I mean, that's the idea. We have to change the Constitution. If you want a new a fairer tax system, we have to change the Constitution and not to defend it. About exceptionalism, I hope that, I don't think that comparative history is to push away, I mean, the exception of country. I mean, of course, each country has its own fiscal history and its own way of resistance. I mean, a very funny anecdote, but a friend of mine who studies Italian history, I mean, I've asked him if he knows Italian tax protest and forms of tax resistance, and his answer was, in Italy, tax evasion is tax resistance. I mean, you don't pay taxes, you don't have to protest, I mean, just don't pay taxes. So I don't know if it's true, but knowing some Italian friends, I'm sure it's true. So I don't want, I mean, to get out of any of the peculiarities of each country. What is striking, I mean, as a French historian studying American history, is the way many tensions, many conflicts passed through the issue of taxation. And let me give you one example, which has nothing to do with what I mentioned today. That's tax resistors, left-wing tax resistors during the Vietnam War. And it's very interesting to see that their opposition to the Vietnam War went through taxation, the issue of taxation. And I went to the Swarthmore College, the Peace Collection at Swarthmore College in Philadelphia to study this movement of tax resistance against the Vietnam War. And I asked some friends of mine who study the French resistance against the war in Algeria, for instance, and there was never any mention of taxation. I mean, you have people who opposed the war, who, I mean, gave a lot of money to the Algerian people, who brought a suitcase with money in it, but they never questioned, I mean, the tax compliance, and they still pay taxes, even if they disagree with what the French state was doing in Algeria. I mean, it was still, and it was not the case. I mean, it was those tax resistors, I mean, decide not to pay the taxes because they opposed. I think you have some, maybe is there something exceptional in spite of different moments of time and different periods. That's a more complicated relationship with the federal government and with on the issue of taxation.
I think this can be also an explanation of why in America the tax resistance is not confined to an extreme right party, but is part of a mainstream party. In Europe, I think that tax resistance is just culturally lower, and that's why it's confined in the extremes because it's not an argument that you hear very much in the everyday debate. Whereas here in America, it's all over the place, probably because of this conjunction of what you said, the ideological and the pocket resisted. Maybe also because America, I mean, when the first revolts in America were tax revolts against the British, and it's interesting that the Tea Party, went back to, the Tea Party event in Boston, and it's deeply rooted in the American history, and that probably in America you're not ashamed of being against taxes, whereas in Europe somehow it's not something you talk that openly about, and I think it's probably also just a cultural difference. I mean, I'm just mentioning that, but you don't seem to.
Yeah. Do you want to?
I don't know. I guess my perception would be that in France there's also, of course, the revolutionary, the memory of a revolution that was partly about grievances about taxation.
Taxation, yes. Right. But I think things have changed in France. Many people and many politicians today, I mean, they publicly criticize the tax system and the tax code. I mean, it's things have changed in France.
This question, your comment about Italy was interesting. I think it's completely true. I mean, no tax protest because small and medium-sized enterprise that can basically just evade their taxes, and there's a tradition for that. I mean, that's a strong political legacy. But I mean, more generally, what's the relationship between tax evasion and tax protest? Because you also touched upon it, saying more or less, when the French government started actually collecting revenues from small businesses, that's when the tax protests rise. So I mean, is tax protest, well, are the people who are protesting against the tax system the ones that can't evade or that can't evade anymore? For instance, you also have the Irish tax protests, 1979 and 80. Basically, I mean, it's huge. I mean, Ireland, 5 million people, 750,000 people take to the streets, pay as you earn employees, basically because they can't evade tax in the system, while the farmers and the self-employed are evading taxes. So, I mean, do you have any compound relationship between tax evasion and tax protests as such?
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, Isaac knows a lot about this. I mean, when the tax system was transformed in France, and the most famous case is tax collectors asking for a book of accounts. It was totally new for many, for Pierre Poujade and for many small business owners. I mean, because they didn't have one, and they used to cheat on the taxes, and so it was. Of course, they opposed this transformation of the tax system, and they opposed the intrusion of the tax collectors into their office. I mean, one of the strategies was to be with some friends. I mean, in front of the house, and to prevent the tax collector from entering into the house. I mean, just as a direct confrontation. You don't have to go into my shop or. So but I think that's only part of the explanations. I mean, that's only part of the story. I mean, there was something deeper into the Poujade movement. I mean, there was strong ideology against the federal government for the reason I've mentioned. So we have to look at the transformation of the tax collection, but also, I mean, to enlarge the way we look at those movements of tax resistance. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, I'm going to get the year wrong. I think it's 1977. There's a moment when Italy tries to make restaurateurs keep receipts, and they go on strike. Every restaurant in Italy, and I think this does show that it's sort of. The ability to evade can become a custom that then comes to be seen as legitimate, and if you're the restaurant owner who never pays taxes, you think that's okay because the people with salaries, sure, they pay more tax, but they get other benefits that you don't get, and so that, the tax break is your benefit, right? And I think that's very important.
part of the story in many times and places.
I just hope there was no Italian in the place.
I was wondering, part of the debate between you two seems to be caused by the word tax protest, where Isaac sees more tax protest than Roman seems to. And it seems like that term is being used to refer both to social movements, social movements, as well as party politics. And I don't think the fault is with either what you have said, so much as in the literature does kind of conflate these two things. And it seems that the real question in some ways is when and how the social history becomes political history. I mean, I know that, Romain, your goal is to do a social history here, but it seems like the real question was, okay, so you have these kinds of marginal movements. You also have politicians trying to take it mainstream. Reagan succeeds, Chirac fails. It seems like that sort of question, when the social history meets the political history, is really where the action is happening. And this is where all of the questions that other people have been bringing up comes in. The different ways in which, say, the economic crisis of the 70s or the tax structure feeds into whether it's possible for politicians to turn these kinds of marginal movements into something much more broad-based. So, long comment.
I agree with you, Monica. And that's the most difficult part, writing the book, because I had the feeling that you have this very long ideological resistance, with the same arguments, the same idea, with different social structures, from the 19th century to the 1970s. But sometimes it failed, sometimes it succeeded, and I have to explain that. The moment when it was captured by politicians, when it became a very, very popular movement, for instance, after World War I, you have this reaction against the World War I structure, pushed by the upper class, big corporations after World War I. And you have the popular support for the Mellon Plan, for instance. I work on this recently at the archives. And you have many in Republican clubs, in Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, people signing petitions in 1923, 1924 to support the Mellon Plan, and which they won't benefit from it because most of them didn't pay taxes. So that's what I want to do social history of institution, but I really want to mix social history and political history. I think the two are going together and hand in hand if you want to understand this whole tax resistance and why sometimes it became the priority of policymakers and politicians, and why sometimes it was just seen as business as usual and not a very important matter. I don't know, maybe you have different...
No, I think that's really perceptive about sort of what the issue is. And
I once tried to make this argument that, look, millions of French workers out in the streets protesting against the Juppé plan, right? That's partly tax protests, because part of what's going on is there's a proposal to increase income tax to pay. Before an audience of distinguished welfare state scholars, including an esteemed French colleague who wasn't having it, and told me, no, that's not tax protest. President Bush, this was a long time ago, is a tax protester, right? And to my way of thinking, no. President Bush was, at the time, someone governing the country who made a real pretense of being a protester, but a protest is a movement. And I think that terminological difference probably has accepting the representations of President Bush and the leading lights of the Republican Party that they are tax protesters, I worry risks eliding the difference between doing something like what Caroline Abney did in 1955 in Marshall, Texas, and what someone does when they propose a policy that cuts income taxes.
Well, I want to thank both of you for a really excellent paper and really excellent comments. It's been a wonderful panel and a wonderful discussion. I also want to thank our interveners here and give you all a round of applause.